Yesterday, Donald Trump made a comment that the media chooses not to cover certain terror attacks. Some are underreported, some go unreported. And he said something to the effect of, and they have their reasons, as you know, implying that the media is choosing not to cover terror attacks. Now, as someone who is in the media, sitting next to a guy who's even more in the media with a longer history in it, the idea that the media doesn't cover terror attacks seems crazy. I mean, if it's a plane that has gone missing, it receives 95 hours of coverage. Right. If it's a shooting, that is the only thing that is covered on networks. And so that seems odd. So we have Jake Tapper talking with Kellyanne Conway today on CNN about that claim by Donald Trump. And I do like the way that Tapper frames his response.
CNN and other media organizations cover terrorism around the world all the time. Saying that we don't cover terrorism, that's just false.
What the president is saying there, Jake, is that there are other attacks that don't get as much coverage. Obviously, the very sad incidents that you related where, frankly, CNN did amazing coverage for weeks at a time. I saw you all there on the ground doing that and telling the human interest stories and the tragic stories and, frankly, the involvement of the terrorists in those brutal attacks. Those get coverage. The other ones on the list, not so much. I think his point is twofold. One is that we just can't allow ourselves to become inured to terrorist attacks, to see it as the new normal.
Your spin about the idea that we don't want to be inured to that's a lovely spin, but that's not what he was saying, Kellyanne. He was saying the media does not cover these stories because we don't want to cover them because we have some sort of agenda. That's what he was suggesting, and it's offensive given the fact that CNN and other media organizations have reporters in danger right now in war zones covering ISIS. And I just don't understand how the president can make an attack like that. President Trump was clearly saying that the media does not cover terrorist attacks that we clearly cover. And he was saying we don't do it because we don't want to do it and because we have some sort of ulterior motive in that. That's not what you're saying right now, but that is what he's saying.
And so, look, that's interesting. There's a couple different angles on this. But one thing that I do want to push into this second video with Jake Tapper, because by bringing up the media supposedly not covering terror attacks, I think the natural response is to then think about what sort of terror attacks get attention from the president himself, since he's the one making the claim. Now let's watch this.
6 people were killed. President Trump has not said or tweeted one public word about this. You want to talk about ignoring terrorism? Why hasn't the president offered his sympathy to our neighbors in the north?
I know he's sympathetic to any loss of life. It's completely senseless, and it needs to stop regardless of who is lodging the attack. We of course are very sad about loss of life here, and he is talking about trying to stop terrorism and people who want to do harm to this country. And I'm sure in the case of our neighbors to the north, I'm glad that the Prime Minister of Canada is coming here next week. I'm sure they'll talk about that if he's coming soon, as I understand. But the fact is that I will ask him, he doesn't tweet about everything, he doesn't make a comment about everything. Put us on record as always being sad about this as a senseless loss of life.
He tweeted when there was that attack at the Louvre Museum where nobody was killed. I don't understand why he wouldn't tweet when 6 Canadian citizens were murdered, except for the fact that the undercover document that the White House distributed the other day, last night rather, also did not mention any attacks other than those committed by Muslim terrorists. And obviously radical Islamic terrorism is a big problem, but there are all sorts of kinds of horrific terrorism that take place. We saw some of that in South Carolina recently. And I guess the question is, are these victims any less dead than the ones killed by Islamic radical terrorists?
No, not at all.
So that's a good response from her, right. But I would love to have that question asked to Donald Trump. And why is it that he made time? Like we were having a talk earlier in the show about balancing what you tweet about. And that's totally fair. You tweet about serious things, you tweet about little things and big things. But if he can tweet about the attempted stabbing in France that resulted in the deaths of no innocents, Quebec happened. It was news for a long time. I think CNN even covered it, by the way. But he made no time to talk about it. And they put out that list, which looked like a 5th grader had assembled it. It was full of typos and weird mistakes. And it was a list of things that supposedly the media hadn't covered. If you look over it, you're going to recognize those attacks because the media covered them. And there were none listed.
And they got the list by looking at media coverage, too.
That's how they found it.
Yeah.
And so that list of attacks, which was extensive, included no attacks that targeted non-Westerners, no attacks done by Christian extremists or white separatists, right-wingers of any kind, sovereign citizens. There are lists out there if you'd like to find them. That sort of terror happens all the time in the U.S. and throughout North America.
That's because we overcover it. We overcover it.
Probably overcover it.
Yeah.
You know, like weird that for some reason the Charleston shooting wasn't on that list. Hard to imagine why that didn't merit his attention. Except that it's not hard to imagine because for some reason, perhaps because he knows where his bread is buttered as a politician, he knows what his base of support is, Donald Trump and his administration have now laid out as an official position that they are going to attempt to provide rhetorical cover for white conservative terrorists and their terror attacks. We're not going to focus on them, and by taking apart the CVE program, the Countering Violent Extremism program, they're showing that we're also not going to investigate them. Now, we're not going to try to stop right-wingers from committing acts of terror. But if it's a Muslim, then we'll talk about them. And if we think it's a Muslim, we'll talk about it, and then when it turns out it's a white person, we're going to stop talking about it. It's weird how they manage that situation.
And if it's a shooting at a mosque, like what happened in Quebec, forget it. Right.
What would have been amazing is, what if the guy goes to Quebec and he's shooting up the mosque, and someone inside of the mosque shoots out and accidentally hits a Canadian? Would they have covered it then? I don't know. I mean, maybe we'll find out at some point. But it's ridiculous that she's trying to. She said, the literal words she said was, put us down as always being sad when terrorism happens.
Right.
That's a shitty little parody of what a spokesman for a president would actually say.
And the shitty little thing that we're asking for is a tweet, too, which is absurd that we're asking for, right?
Yeah.
Typically, the White House would say, the president and Mrs. Trump send our condolences to the people of Quebec over the horrific shooting that happened in the... It would be boring and most people wouldn't see it, but it was White House acknowledgement. It wouldn't be, too bad for Quebec, it's cold up there, whatever he would tweet,
Exactly.
If you sign up for TYT membership, you'll be saying,
thanks a lot, bitch.
TYTnetwork.com/join.